Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Hawker, and I am with the Open Minds Market Intelligence team, and I would like to welcome all of you to today's Circle Elite Executive Roundtable, Telehealth Emergency to Digital Transformation, the Pinebrook Family Answers Case Study. Today's roundtable features Matt Welser, Innovative Technology Analyst from Pinebrook Family Answers. Matt's education in psychology and background experience as a direct service provider give him a unique perspective on the technological needs of behavioral health and social service organizations. Matt served as a direct care provider for youth and families with mental health needs before his professional journey took a turn in 2014, when Matt was asked to become the electronic health record administrator for Pinebrook Family Answers. Technology has long been Matt's passion, so making this transition to information technology was a natural fit. In less than a year, Matt progressed to the role of Information Systems Manager and became one of the agency's administrative team. In his current role as the Innovative Technology Analyst, Matt is tasked with maximizing the use of current IT systems and technologies while exploring new ones with the goal of advancing Pinebrook's mission. Matt has been the electronic health record administrator for over 8 years now. During that time, Matt has managed and provided user and training for multiple Welligent EHR implementations across a variety of different behavioral health and social service programs. Matt's duties also include the administration of 5 additional SaaS systems, including Microsoft Office 365, and all telecommunications related systems and services for Pinebrook Family Answers. Moderating today's roundtable will be Nancy Martin, Open Minds Senior Associate. Nancy brings 25 years of experience in the behavioral health field to Open Minds. Ms. Martin currently serves as Senior Associate on the Open Minds consulting team. Previously, Ms. Martin was the AVP Risk Adjustment for Molina Healthcare Incorporated, where she was responsible for establishing strategy and managing operations for the company's risk adjustment operations across 18 states. This included developing and implementing strategies for member engagement, provider engagement, value-based contracting models, and population health. Prior to her work at Molina, Ms. Martin served as the Senior Corporate Advisor for Population Health Strategy and Solution at EV-Base LLC, an organization that offers evidence-based programs to help with people with chronic disease that improve their health and quality of life. Ms. Martin also served as the Senior Director of Value-Based Contracting and Network Development for Lumeris, where she was responsible for value-based contracting and network development for Lumeris clients' Medicare markets. As the Vice President and Quality and Operation for Population Health and Medical Mutual of Ohio, Ms. Martin was responsible for Medicare starts, risk adjustment, quality disease management, and population health for all lines of business at Ohio's largest mutual health insurance company. She had oversight of all aspects of quality for the organization, including HEDIS, Medicare Stars, CAHPS, accreditation, and value-based networks. Prior to her role at Medical Mutual of Ohio, Ms. Martin served as the Senior Vice President, Network Services for Value Options, the nation's largest independent behavioral health and wellness company. In this role, she oversaw national network strategy and service to a network of 70,000 providers to incorporate progressive contracting models such as Centers of Excellence, Telehealth, and value-based contracting. Ms. Martin received her Bachelor of Arts in French from the University of Kansas and her master's degree in International Management and MBA with an emphasis in Finance and Accounting from the American Graduate School of International Management. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping reminders. Your audio will be muted during today's briefing. However, we encourage you to submit any and all questions you may have using the question box on the right side of your screen. We will present audience questions at the end. Finally, the slides and recording from today's briefing will be available on the Open Minds website by tomorrow. Nancy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brandon, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. Matt, since you've got control, if you don't mind going to the first slide. Thank you for listening to those introductions. It's definitely my pleasure to be here today. I think the COVID-19 experience is something we're going to talk about for many, many years to come, almost like, where were you when this happened? So I'm really happy to be part of this presentation because I know we all have our, let's call them war stories and stories of innovation from COVID. I'm looking forward to hearing Matt's case study. Let's go on to the next slide. So for our learning objectives, the theme here at least for me, is times of crisis present excellent opportunities for learning. And in listening to Matt's case study, we're going to be able to learn practical application about technology implementation, how to navigate healthcare regulations in a primarily government run business and payer business, and then from a practical perspective, how to manage the various challenges that come in place with these technological innovations. Let's go on to the next slide. I just wanted to say a couple words in general about innovation in times of crisis, and then I'm going to give a little bit of context about telehealth before we get to the meat of the presentation. So we can go on to the next slide, Matt. Thank you. So I just thought it would be fun and kind of interesting to think of examples of crises and, from wars to economic crisis to the recent pandemic that are really fertile ground for innovation. And I've often spoke as the silver lining, or one of the silver linings of COVID is the expansion of telehealth, especially in the behavioral health field, where we've had a gap and it's been a much needed service. And so this is really an excellent example. But it just made me pause a little bit and to think back. We talk about, the wars being case studies for advances in medicine, plastic surgery, and even, the use of penicillin going way back to Roman times. The tourniquet was invented out of a time of war. And then more recently, I was interested to see, well, what are some other examples? Netflix and streaming devices grew out of the recession. And everyone, I'm sure, has seen Apollo 13 when the scientists had a certain amount of time to replicate the conditions on the aircraft. So just keeping all of these examples in mind, depending on what desk you're sitting at or what function you're doing during COVID, whether you're a provider of medical services. I happen to be on the payer side. I was at Molina running a risk adjustment operation. And, I have a similar case study, which I'm not going to go over today, but we had to shift our in-home visit program to a telehealth program and be very nimble in doing that. So anyway, I know everyone has their quote war stories about this, and it's just maybe interesting to think about the big perspective of crisis-inspired innovation. So enough about that. Let's go to the next slide. And I wanted to just go over what really happens during a crisis. What frees up an organization to be innovative? And I did a little bit of research, and the conclusions are that the purpose and the goals of a corporation become very clear during a time of crisis. It's all about problem solving. You don't find that you really need to post the company goals on the door, on the bulletin board, or design your new mission statement, because it's very clear what the goals are, and that's to solve this problem. Number two, seeing the system differently. And I know a lot of times that's what we hire consultants for, but during a time of crisis, you're forced to confront the truth. Maybe things that have been vulnerabilities all along are more glaringly obvious during a time of crisis. And then 3 and 4 are closely related, and these are maybe my favorite attributes that can happen in an organization during a time of crisis. A lot of times, we get stuck in standardized procedures and things swing from one extreme to the other. But during a time of crisis and the type of decision making that has to happen, there's definitely a bias towards action. And so different types of committees, or just the pace of ideation, decision-making, implementation is increased. And when that pace increases, there's less of a fear of failure, because you try things, you fail, you learn, you implement, you innovate. So I think, I don't want to give away the case study, but I think we're going to hear a lot about these attributes from Matt's presentation. And then finally, if we go on to the next slide, I just wanted to give some context for telehealth. And I don't necessarily need to go over these slides in detail, but it's kind of been an interesting journey. And I've lived in the Medicare world for about 30 years. And historically, Medicare has been very archaic in its approach to telehealth. Historically, and kind of unbelievably, the Medicare patient had to go to a remote site in order to be eligible for telehealth, and it was really looked at as a rural service. So the silver lining here is that the public health emergency really lifted all the restrictions as far as originating site and services, CPT codes that could be covered. The real question that everyone's asking now is, once the public emergency is lifted, what's the future of telehealth? Which I'm just going to say 2 words about that in a second. But there's all kinds of statistics out there now about the increase in telehealth based on COVID. And at its peak, there's different versions of this, but the conservative one that I settled on for this presentation was 38 times higher during the peak of COVID. Now it's kind of settled back to be about 13 to 17 times higher, which is incredible. So that is a word about current trends, and let's go on to the next slide, Matt. So these trends will continue to evolve, and as I just mentioned, it looks like the restrictions will be permanently lifted. Just this week, there was a bill presented in Congress that basically moves the basic geographic requirements and expands the definition of originating sites, expands the definition of who can provide telehealth, and I'm talking about beyond the public health emergency. There are still gaps, but the bill before Congress is fairly comprehensive. And it's interesting because I think that behavioral health is one of the service areas that has been the most prevalent, that has seen the most prevalent use of telehealth. So let's go on to the next. The gaps are still there, and I'm not going to say a lot about this now because this is something that will be interesting to hear Matt talk about during his case study. But with any solution, it doesn't solve everything, and new innovation sometimes presents new problems. One thing I'm looking out for, besides on the technical side, is whenever the government expands the scope of services or adds CPT code or coverage codes, they also then follow that up pretty quickly with new rules, new audit criteria, and things like that. So always, waiting for the hammer to fall on the next phase of this. But with that being said, I think that's all I have as the way of kind of setting the scene. So Matt, I am happy to turn this over to you, and look forward to hearing your case study.
Thanks, Nancy, and thank you very much to Open Minds for having me here today and for allowing me the opportunity to tell Pinebrook's story and what we went through during the pandemic, and how we've really turned the corner into this digital transformation and what we're doing now. So There's the title of the presentation again, moving from a telehealth emergency to digital transformation, the Pinebrook Family Answers case study. And I'm going to dive right into it. As Brandon said earlier, my name is Matt Welser. I'm the Innovative Technology Analyst for Pinebrook Family Answers. Thanks, Brandon, for that long bio. One thing that I will add is that at Pinebrook, when we talk about technology in the IT department, we actually fall under quality assurance as well. We have a lot of crossover. We work very closely together. So when I get into talking about what happened early on and how we're navigating some of the regulations now, I think that'll be borne out a little bit as well. Little about Pinebrook Family Answers. We serve the greater Lehigh Valley area of Pennsylvania. It's Lehigh and Northampton County, primarily in Pennsylvania, as well as Carbon County, and we're expanding. Our main office is in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and we have 2 additional behavioral health clinics in Easton and Wind Gap. We serve over 5,000 clients annually across 20 different types of programs, and those include outpatient behavioral health, foster care, forensics, integrative behavioral health programs in schools and our local police departments, family-based services, and probably about 6 or 7 other community-based programs as well. I love this picture. I found this very early on. I think it was week 1 during the pandemic. If you're able to see my background, this is what you would have seen with me week 1 during the pandemic. As we closed down our offices, I came home. I was very used to, as most of us were, 5 days a week in the office. And then all of a sudden it was, as for most of us, it was my home office in this environment here, pre-virtual backgrounds even being a thing. So I love, as I said, I love this slide. You know, what pushed the digital transformation for your company? I was very fortunate at Pinebrook that even before the pandemic, I had a lot of support from our executive leadership team, but it was really COVID that really kicked things forward and gave us that little bit of a kickstart to really get into telehealth and expand what we were doing digitally. And a lot of that came out of necessity, as Nancy was talking about earlier. So I'm going to talk a little about our transformation and what transpired in late March, April of 2020, and then go on into where we are now and some of the challenges that we've faced. The first portion of that transformation that came into focus very quickly, along with understanding and very clearly knowing what our mission had to be at that point, was fairly obvious. We had to continue to serve our clients no matter what, and that meant that we had to safely reach them where they live. They could no longer come into our offices. We weren't able to go out to their homes at that point because safety was a major question. And how are we going to do that? The answer very quickly became we were going to use telehealth in some way, shape, or form, but we weren't really sure how that was going to look. And we knew that we needed something video related. We needed to be able to make phone calls because now we have staff working from home, and our phone system is certainly not going to get the job done because that's tied to our offices, and you can't take a desk phone home with you. So how are we going to navigate that piece of the puzzle? And we had begun looking at Microsoft Teams internally just before the pandemic really hit. We started looking at it in January of 2020, and it was kind of out there, nebulous. There were probably only 5 of us actually using it on and off at that point. And the big question became, is that really the right solution for us? And this became a major question because I very vividly remember a Monday night conversation with our head of quality assurance, and him and I having a conversation, and him saying, we got to come up with a system that'll work, and we have to find something. And I said, we're going to need to be able to audit it down the line. I know we're going to need to be able to audit whatever we do. And he said, yeah, there's this question about HIPAA though. We got to meet those requirements too. I said, okay, let's keep that in focus. And I had said to him that night, there's no way they're going to suspend the HIPAA requirements. It'll never happen. And all the regulations that are happening here, the HIPAA requirements for video were very stringent at the time. They're not going to relax those. I'll bet you any amount of money. I'm really glad my supervisor didn't take that bet, because when we came in the next morning, he forwarded me an email that said those regulations were now off the table. They had been suspended, and we could use any video system that we wanted. And along with that, our staff started emailing us saying, which systems can we use, and listing out everything that was out there. And we immediately focused on the fact that we wanted to continue to use Teams. Zoom was kind of on the table, but we went with Teams because Teams was already in the Office 365 suite we had. We weren't going to have to deal with it from a budget perspective, having to add an additional expense like we would have had to do to get the proper Zoom licensing on board at that point. And we didn't want to go to the free options because we had that eye on we're going to need to be able to audit this at some point down the line. And there was heavy concern, and rightfully so, from QI that situations may arise where there could be some discrepancies in what we're hearing about service provision from a couple different perspectives, and we need to be able to have data to say, no, we're providing these services and we're doing them well. So Microsoft Teams was the way we went. You'll hear me talk about Teams throughout this presentation a couple of times, but the way that we went about putting Teams in place early on also was we compiled a bunch of training resources over several days. I did, I think, 6 or 7 live trainings in the span of 2 days. They were about an hour each. And then those were all recorded and put into a Microsoft SharePoint site so that anybody that needed a refresher could hop in and see their program-specific training. We came up with written information. We grabbed everything we could that was available for free on the internet, everything that Microsoft had available for free, and we built those all into what we use with SharePoint to house those training resources so that they become on demand. And that became the first piece of the puzzle for us over time of building out a much larger training repository, which I'll talk about a little later in this presentation also. And then one point we are very proud of is that our outpatient clinics were shut down for a grand total of 48 hours. We closed the doors for physical services on a Monday night. We reopened for complete virtual services that Wednesday morning and started conducting appointments. And that was all of our providers were in the proverbial pool at that point providing telehealth services. And that was a huge undertaking. And I cannot take all the credit for that. That goes a lot to our staff and a lot to our team who saw that need, who saw the need to keep the mission going. And I'm going to use that metaphor again, hopped into that swimming pool and we all learned how to swim together. Another piece of this puzzle that fell together nicely for us was telepsychiatry. In Pennsylvania, there is a major shortage for telepsychiatrists. And one of the things that we had started doing about 2 years before the pandemic started, maybe 3 actually, was reaching out to different vendors. We work with Iris Telehealth, we work with Genoa Healthcare, we work with the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and we were trying to find doctors who could provide services via telehealth. And we had 3 telepsychiatrists at that point. We have 4 now. And that piece, having that piece in place was also interesting because while we said, yes, we're going to use Microsoft Teams, each of those doctors and vendors had their own systems. So we had to work with them to get them into Microsoft Teams and understanding how Teams worked there as well. So that's kind of the early on telehealth piece. How Matt didn't sleep for the first 2 weeks of April is how you can sum up that slide. And then we started looking very quickly at our evolving data collection needs. What did we need to collect? And part of this was looking into a crystal ball and hopefully making some really great inferences of what we might need down the line, because it was almost this Wild West of you can use any system you want. And as I said, we leaned heavily towards Teams, although there were situations where to reach certain foster care clients and clients that may not have been able to get on Teams right away, we did say, okay, we can do a little bit of FaceTime and that sort of thing with our agency devices. But we started looking at, okay, how do we know that we're providing quality services in the midst of all of this chaos? And one of the tools that we had in place for outpatient already, and we have since expanded to our integrated behavioral health programs, is a tool called GreenSpace that allows us to send surveys virtually to our clients. They fill them out in their email. It's completely HIPAA compliant. They fill it out. They have the option of logging into a portal to see their results if they would like, but we get information back like therapeutic alliance. How do they feel their relationship is with their therapist or their provider? How do they feel their services are going? And then we can get some outcomes data in there as well. GreenSpace allows us to, I believe there's between 30 and 40 different tools that are in there, things like the PSQ-9, different symptoms measurement metrics and things like that. Many different tools, standardized tools that are in there and allowed us to get at that outcomes data. And I have a whole slide on our electronic health record next, but we looked at our electronic health record for our appointments metrics. One of the major concerns right off the bat was, are we completing appointments at the same rate? Are we going to be able to generate revenue at the same rate? Have we lost clients? Have we gained clients? Trying to get an accurate picture and get some data in, and what do our outcomes look like there? And I'll share a couple of statistics with you of what we can look back and see now. The therapeutic alliance score in GreenSpace is a 0 to 100 score, and our number prior to the pandemic was 85%. During the pandemic was 85%. Since the pandemic has been 85%. So that number for us actually stayed 100% static through the entire process. And we looked at that number in a few different ways, and we're like, is this too good to be true? And no, that was the answer of our entire client base, kept that therapeutic alliance score at 85%. Our outcomes stayed pretty much the same as they were before the pandemic as well. When we looked at our GreenSpace outcomes measures, there wasn't a whole lot of fluctuation in those scores. When we looked at our appointment metrics through the electronic health record, and as Brandon mentioned earlier, we do use Welligent, which is powered by Continuum Cloud. We took a look at those measurements, and prior to the pandemic, we were completing about 64% of our scheduled appointments. We would schedule for outpatient about 25 to 28,000 appointments a year, depending on what you were looking at. No, it's a really large number. I'm talking about a whole year at a shot here. Since we started using telehealth, and this picked up almost immediately in 2020, there was a natural dip in April of 2020, but I'm talking May 2020 on. We've now gone up to a completion measurement of 75% of all our scheduled appointments get completed, and that number of scheduled appointments is now between 30 and 32,000. So we're scheduling more appointments, and we're also completing a higher percentage of those appointments that actually are scheduled. And we attribute that to being able to reach individuals that we wouldn't have been able to reach when they actually had to come into our office for a variety of reasons. And I'm going to talk about the client side of things in a little while as well, because we have some wonderful stories about individuals that we've been able to provide services for that without telehealth we wouldn't have been able to. We did keep an eye on value-based purchasing and reimbursement in Pennsylvania. The state switched over to reimbursing instead of fee-for-service. They reimbursed us based on volume for outpatient. We wanted to make sure that we had that data there for that information and for all of our other funders that we deal with as well. We very early on focused on what is quality improvement going to need and what is development going to need, because we have a potential budgeting issue here. We're not sure how the numbers are going to shake out after all of this. What might development need for marketing? And our development director gave us the charge that we needed to make sure that we had good material, good numbers, any reporting that she needed. We needed to be able to provide so that she could in real time turn around and say to individuals and local foundations that were offering to help us, this is what we're doing. These are our completion statistics right now. This is how many services we completed in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic. We're here, we're providing services and making the case for those individual funders and donations through that data as well. We got regulatory whiplash, I think everybody did through the first couple of months of the pandemic. Everything was changing. I told that little anecdote about HIPAA by itself. In terms of outpatient, I was in constant contact with our Vice President of Clinical Services who oversees our outpatient department, and it was 3-4 times a day back and forth about whatever regulations were changing at that point, and then talking to all our community-based supervisors as well, who were getting information in real time from the counties and the state about what we were able to do and what we weren't able to do. And in most cases, I know I'm talking a lot about our outpatient department, but our community-based programs really followed suit. They were doing all of their services virtually at that point as well. And one of the big questions was, we're talking about all this data collection, we're talking about potentially new documentation in our electronic health record. How do we incorporate all that into existing workflows? And we wanted to create new items, but also find ways to remove or displace other things or incorporate existing pieces of the workflow. So when we had our existing intake documentation, instead of reinventing the wheel and adding another form for telehealth, we incorporated what we needed to right into that existing intake paperwork. We weren't trying to add extra documentation. We were trying to roll everything up into what we currently had, so we weren't overloading our staff who are already overloaded in a variety of different ways.
Matt, just a quick question on the regulations piece. I know as I sat on the payer side, one of my biggest challenges in adapting during COVID was monitoring all the different regulations, federal, state. And so how did that look from your seat? Like who are your payers, and did you have a whole slate of different regulations that you had to monitor, and how did you do that?
Our biggest payer is Medicaid through Magellan Behavioral Health and CCBH in Pennsylvania for outpatient. They're lucky for us, their regulations pretty much lined up through the pandemic. And the big piece that we had our eye on was the state regulations in Pennsylvania and watching what the state was going to do and the rate the state was reacting and what could and couldn't we do based on those state regulations. So the big one right off the bat was, what is the state going to say about healthcare? And shout out to the state of Pennsylvania. They turned that corner very quickly and said, here's what we can do regulatorily. So we took a team approach to trying to monitor the change in regulations, and a lot of the direct program supervisors were actively monitoring what those regulations were. And our QI department, myself, anything that was computer related, we were actively looking and hunting on a daily basis to see what might have been changing. So we were on top of it, and any new opportunities that were coming up, we were able to take advantage of and weren't behind the 8 ball.
Thanks. Just curious about that.
I'm going to talk a little bit about our EHR, and I'm going to try not to make this too much of a commercial for Welligent, but I've been using Welligent for 8 years now. I am a huge fan of Welligent. Welligent is a cloud-based system. We don't host any of that data locally. They host all of our data for us. So therefore, they've been a long time piece of our disaster recovery plan. And when we started with Welligent, we used to think of disaster recovery as, well, if something happens to this building, we can get another space and we can start working again really quickly as a group in the office together. And we didn't necessarily think of, well, what if we all can't be in the same office together for some sort of health related reason? That really didn't come up. But luckily for us, with Welligent being cloud-based, we were able to have our staff go home and work from home and still have access to all of that client record data with little to no interruption in what was needed to facilitate that. The other piece that we were very fortunate with Welligent is they were incredibly proactive in terms of creating new resources and features for their customers very early on. Within 3 to 4 weeks of the pandemic, they had added a component to their system where we were able to send out email blasts and text message blasts to our clients, our customers, our consumers. We were able to also, they incorporated a telehealth component that should someone need it, it was there and available as well. And a lot of other features that came out there as well, methods for tracking different registry information, and to the point where you were actually would have been able to track vaccine information, and we tracked appointments, which clients we were completing documentation for that we weren't able to get physical signatures. That was a huge issue that we had early on, was that the state said it's okay to not get digital signatures right now, or any kind of signature. You can go ahead and get verbal confirmation. And we kind of looked into that regulatory crystal ball and said, we're probably going to need signatures at some point. So Welligent gave us a tool to be able to track that information. And we were able to rely on that down the road to say, okay, these are the individuals that we do want to have sign things. We're going to go back and we're going to have them sign either paper or electronically as soon as we're able to. So Welligent did give us a big leg up. We were already there when it was a question of, we need to add some kind of COVID attestation for our clients. We need to add a new bit of documentation. We need to update documentation. We were able to do those changes in real time. I was able to do those changes. They took effect immediately. They were available for providers immediately. They were available for clients immediately. So we leaned on Welligent very heavily during the pandemic, and they responded in kind. And I can safely say that without them, the beginning for us would have looked very, very different in terms of how things might have turned out. big piece that we dealt with as well, and these are some things that we dealt with on an ongoing basis beyond just the basics of telehealth, which is why I made this its own slide, is we talked a lot about telecommunications in general. So many of you may remember those lovely COVID maps that came out right in the beginning of the pandemic where they would color code. And our main office in Allentown was always in the bright red zone. No matter what, it never changed. It might still be there, to be honest with you, but it was always in that bright red COVID zone through the entire pandemic. So there was that concern of, okay, having staff come into the office is a risk. We need to realize that that's an inherent risk. How are we going to deal with that? I made mention of this earlier, but we had older phone systems in 3 of our offices. And what that means is those systems they were extension based. You were not able to easily access your voicemail externally. We weren't able to control them externally. Somebody had to be on site to change messages and things like that. And we knew that we were missing client phone calls because when staff did go in, we had blinking lights on phones and we knew that there were voicemails being missed. We did our best to make sure that those were forwarded on to providers by email, but we were really limited in how we could do that with that system. So what we ended up doing is shifting all of our phone systems from traditional phone desk systems with a localized telephone provider to a completely virtual system. And we do all of our calling through Teams calling. So none of our staff currently have a desk phone that is assigned to them. Everybody makes phone calls directly through their laptop, and they either have that soft phone, that Teams soft phone, or they have a cell phone that's been issued by the agency. And we tie that all together in auto attendance for each of our locations. So a client can call in and navigate that auto attendant, and whether or not that individual has Teams calling or they have a cell phone because they work for community-based program, the client can still get to that individual right through that same system. So the client doesn't have to worry about all those behind the scenes idiosyncrasies that us IT guys do. They can get their provider when they need the provider. Again, just another concern here, providers couldn't call from home. We had a couple of instances where providers, they were trying to block their number early on when they were calling, but they ended up exposing their personal number. And then the inherent situation there where a client might have your personal number and might overstep those boundaries in terms of calling just a little too much. This next bullet point here, I feel like I should raise my right hand and say, my name's Matt Welser and I can't stand faxes. For some reason, I don't know why, I just don't like them. But one of the issues that we had early on, and this might be why I'm so biased, is that we did have staff members that had to drive into the office just to send a fax. And I couldn't wrap my head around that because we did have certain providers, and I'm not trying to knock those providers, but we had certain, not providers, payers, and certain state agencies, Social Security, things like that, that have to do business that way. They need to receive faxes, and we understand that. But we were having to have staff come in to send faxes. So one of the other things that we did pretty early on in the pandemic was virtualize our fax system. So now any of our staff members can send and receive faxes from home. They all have a portal they can log into. They can download something right out of our EHR if they need to and fax it over to whichever partner agency or stakeholder they need to be able to send that fax right from their computer without having to run into the office. You still can fax from the office. It's all tied together with those traditional dinosaur fax machines. But it was great for our staff members to not have to make that journey in. And they were even more grateful for it as we saw the price of gas go through the roof the last couple of months too. So a lot of thank yous for that one to IT. And then, as I mentioned, we had to make sure we were still meeting the needs for our community-based employment as employees as far as telecommunications. And they all do have a cell phone. We partner up with Verizon for that. Verizon does take very good care of nonprofits as well. And we had to develop a system where if a phone needed an upgrade or a phone broke, how are we going to deal with that without being able to get directly in contact? So there were several situations where we had phones shipped directly to individuals' homes. I or other members of IT were on the phone with our staff members, helping them through the configuration process of cell phones and things like that. So we got very hands-on and all got to talk very early on in the pandemic, but we needed to make sure that all bases were covered, both our in the office staff and that community-based component as well. Talk about the challenges that we encountered as we went through this process, through this transformation. And some of these are ongoing, and we're learning how to navigate them the best we can as we go, and always building that proverbial better mousetrap as we go too. So part of the theme here in all of these slides and all the different things I'm going to talk about is this idea of moving what was traditional, and traditional in the sense of this is how I've done it for a very long time and I don't want to change it type of things, to a virtual environment. And that kind of tech change, in some case that was very rapid, and in some cases was able to be a bit more planned out and thought out and planned for. So these were a couple of the really popular statements that I heard on a fairly regular basis. I've always had clients sign on paper, and this came up a lot when we started talking about our patient portal. Clients had to sign things on paper, or in our case, with a signature pad into our electronic health record, or some folks felt like it just didn't count. And we talked a lot about using our patient portal and being able to capture documentation signatures and things like that there. There was a lot of documentation we had for our internal processes for HR and our financial department that traditionally needed a signature. How do we talk about attendance for virtual meetings when we can't have everybody sign a sign-in sheet? How do we deal with that? And looking at the tools that are available in apps like Teams, where you can pull an attendance report that is time-stamped and has the person's email address. It's very hard to fake those sorts of things inside of Microsoft Teams. So how do we get financial and HR the documentation that they need? I've always had a phone on my desk. That's definitely not the case for us anymore, as I said earlier. I've always had to send a fax by the fax machine. We've always stored our documents on the local computer network. This was a huge one. Early on, we realized that we were really tied to that computer network, and we had to make a budgetary decision of, do we go ahead and do we get everybody a VPN, virtual private network access to our network so they can get all their documents, or do we make a concerted effort to move things to Office 365 and put them in a shared environment like Microsoft SharePoint or Microsoft OneDrive? And what we did a lot of research on this, and what we ended up doing was moving about 95% of our documents that were on our local network out to SharePoint or out to OneDrive so they could be more easily worked with for those that were working from home. And then we didn't have to take on that additional budgetary component and that hardware component of maintaining a VPN for our entire network and for all of our staff. And the last one here, my stakeholder needs me to present my files in a certain way. And it was very interesting early on as well. A lot of our stakeholders, and again, not trying to knock anybody, but we had an established system. Everybody had an established system of, you would come in, you might use one of our laptops, you would investigate our paper files, and that was no longer an option, that portion of coming in. So we had to find ways around that for audits, where we were able to provide remote credentials for auditors and for our stakeholders to be able to log in and to audit our files or to view our files and help them through. And a lot of this comes down to working with our staff and training and focusing on that mission and making sure we're all rowing the boat in the same direction. I have to digress slightly though, because we do need to talk about hardware a little bit. And some of the things that came up really early on for us was obvious budget constraints. There was that panic week right when the pandemic started of, I need a computer to work from home, and my home laptop won't cut it. I fall into that category. My home laptop, not in great shape. You're probably surprised to hear that from an IT guy, but it's not the one I'd want to use for work or presentations like this or training or anything like that. So how do we get staff the hardware that they need, especially when we have some staff who would come into an office and they had a desktop computer? So in some cases, it was a little unreasonable. Some of our staff members who were perhaps a bit older wouldn't have been able to carry out a full desktop computer rig to take it home. And our IT department is not large enough that we would have been able to get there and get that done rapidly. So very early on, we looked for grant opportunities. We looked for anytime any of the foundations that approached us or individuals approached us and said, what do you need right now? The answer was pretty consistently, we need money for technology. We need to figure out how to purchase some laptops right now. And our director of technology did a great job figuring out ways to find laptops, sometimes rehabbing some from eBay, making sure they fit in the budget. And sometimes that meant we had to build a couple. But what we did was we created a system where we did not necessarily have to worry about staff coming into the building or needing to meet directly with us to repair hardware, to get hardware out to new employees, or to provide support. And the first way we did that, we worked with a managed services provider who functions as our remote help desk. And our contract with them is such that we were able to say, okay, well, our staff's not in the offices anymore. Remote's going to mean home. And that's what it was. We switched our remote approach to we're going to help our staff any way we can with tech remotely. And if something breaks hardware wise, we established a system where a staff member could bring in a broken laptop for whatever reason it happened to be broken. And since we're leaning on cloud-based applications like Microsoft 365 and Welligent, our faxing system, everything else that is now cloud-based, the staff members could pick up a new laptop, spend 15 to 20 minutes on the phone with our help desk getting it set up for them, and then they were back out the door and on the way home without even actually having to go to their desk. They could do it in the front lobby. They could connect to our Wi-Fi there, and then they were back providing services without too much downtime or too much lost productivity. The question then became, the pandemic is still going, how do we make these procedures sustainable? Because it was that, it was a solid reaction. Okay, now how do we proactively plan for this in the future? And we still have that system going. It's still in place now. We are constantly looking at what laptops are out there. We're looking at this point, what's the upgrade to Windows 11 going to look like? How are we going to navigate that as well? A large portion of our services are still being done remotely. 95% for our outpatient, probably a little higher than that. 95% of our services for outpatient are still virtual. All our community-based services have now switched over from this traditional mindset of we're going to be in the office all the time, we're going to meet as a team, to I'm working more remotely, I'm working more from home, maybe I'm only coming in one day a week. So how do we make sure that hardware is there? And also switching our hardware mindset from maybe we can focus a little less on our network resources internally when we're leaning a little more on our SaaS services, on our cloud services, on our electronic health record. We can look at budgetarily what we can do for laptops and things like that and make sure that staff have a higher quality of hardware as well. I know Nancy was excited about this slide, so I'm going to talk about what we encountered then on the client side. And very early on, when we said we're going with Microsoft Teams, we knew that was going to be something that was very new for our clients. So when we were doing that initial round of training and we were training the staff members, our staff members, to use Teams, we also focused on making sure that they could provide some assistance to the clients that were using Teams as well, and making sure that there was that slight troubleshooting component. And the one joke that I told internally that I know our staff got really sick of was I kept saying, you guys should really get credit in IT right now because you're helping with troubleshooting and you're helping with all of those different things. But we had some clients who had never done a video meeting before, had never heard of Teams. We had many who had a smart device, had a phone, but weren't really sure how to use those devices effectively. We, of course, had some that did not have a smart device or a tablet or a laptop or anything like that. That was certainly a challenge. The state of Pennsylvania tossed us a little bit of a lifeline there, in that we were able to make phone calls and provide services by voice only. And that actually became not necessarily a huge part of what we did, but a very important part for the portion of services that we delivered that way, because we found that as we were providing services for individuals, we were getting new clients that were coming in, and we were getting clients that for the first time were able to receive services because they were either disabled, they were elderly, they weren't able to get to our offices. There were some clients who were honestly end of life and had said to some of our therapists, without being able to talk to you over my phone, I might not have had anybody to talk to at this stage in my life. And it's just so important that I'm able to speak to somebody. So one of the things that we applied for with the state of Pennsylvania was a waiver to be able to keep that going, because we do have a subset of clients, and it's not many, it's probably between 20 and 50, but a subset that without that piece in place, we wouldn't be able to reach them at all. And we would much rather reach them than not reach them because of a regulatory issue. So we have our eye very much on that right now. We communicated everything with our clients through email blasts, through videos that we posted on our website. There are training videos up there. Some of the earlier on how to use Teams videos have been replaced with things like how to make payments inside of the patient portal and moving things forward in that regard. But we sent our clients email blasts, videos. Heavy communication between providers and clients was stressed to make sure that the clients were constantly getting the information they needed so that they were an active part of their treatment at all times through their journey with us. And our intake department ended up adding a component where not only are you talking about the normal pieces that go along with intake, but there's a whole separate part of that conversation now that takes place around the technology. And do you have the tech that you need? Do you need any assistance? Are you familiar? What device are you going to be using? And we provide information based on what device the person may be using. Is it an Apple device? Is it an Android device? We have some handouts that go along with that sort of thing. And we're sending that all out typically by email, sometimes snail mail, depending on the situation. But we're making sure that our clients are well saturated in the information that they need to be successful with us. And if we need to, there's been a couple of times where we've hopped on the phone with certain clients as well to try and help them through, but we've given providers that troubleshooting, basic troubleshooting background. I'm not expecting any of them to get IT certs, but we have made sure that they have the information and that they have the training on an ongoing basis. So it wasn't a one shot and done type thing. We train on that. Probably I offer training every 6 to 9 months on that topic to make sure that our providers are getting that info. And when we talk about training, I had mentioned earlier that SharePoint repository that we have. All this information that we're accumulating and that we're putting together through this process, all of our training info for Welligent, for electronic health record, is all centered around our IT SharePoint page. It's divided into sections. Each system that we have has its own section with its own videos. I jokingly tell our staff that you could probably, it's wonderful information for right before you go to sleep at night, but there's probably 30 to 40 hours, if not more than that, worth of video training that's up there, that's on demand. So they're not only getting, as they come in, that initial in-person, they're getting that on demand whenever you might need it training as well. So you may have encountered some change-resistant staff at points, and if you've never heard of Rear Admiral Grace Hopper before, this is one of my favorite quotes, and it is the most dangerous phrase in the language, is "we've always done it that way." We've always done it this way, I'm sorry. Rear Admiral Grace Hopper worked for the Navy, and my understanding is that she tried to retire several times, and she was a computer scientist, and she either came back voluntarily, a couple, or they would bring her back because she was the only one that knew how to do certain innovative things with the computers that she was working with. And I absolutely love that quote because, excuse me, I think it encapsulates a lot of what we deal with when we talk about change resistance and those who have been very comfortable. And we all get into our comfort zones. There's certain things that Microsoft changes that I go, why? But I think this really encapsulates what we run into. So what we found was most helpful for us was first and foremost support from executive management. If our executive leadership team and our CEO was on board with an initiative that we were pushing forward and was helping to champion it for us, I can almost guarantee you success. If they weren't on board, I'm to the point now where if they're not on board, I'm not on board. We're not going to push that forward. We have to make sure that we have that heavy portion of support, and it's being an active part of our conversations and meetings so that we're all going in the same direction. We also found that we needed to explain why the change was good ultimately for the clients. I think it's fairly safe to say that there's 2 reasons that individuals do not get into the realm of counseling, therapy, or social services. One of those is mathematics. The other is computer science. I don't think anybody has got into this particular line of work to work with computers in any way, shape, or form. But here we have this heavy tech component that is now coming through in telehealth, and we are explaining to our staff internally, this is good for the clients. We want to be able to serve our clients. We know that's why you're here. We know that's why you're doing this kind of work. Let us explain how the technology that we have is ultimately good for the clients. The example I gave earlier, we can now reach more clients. We can serve more clients. We can gauge and measure that we're providing quality services for our clients as we're doing that through those data collection tools. Having that understanding for staff, huge as well. Consistent messaging. making sure that when we're talking about things, we are talking about things consistently. We're talking about the project at hand consistently. We're openly communicating. We're letting staff know what's coming, and they're getting messaging not just from IT, but from all different levels of the agency as well. And the last part that we focused on very heavily was varying our training methods. And this was really tricky in terms of doing live training because we couldn't do live in person, we're all in the same room training. When I started doing IT trainings, that was all I did. I have very vivid memories of being in conference rooms with network cables everywhere because Wi-Fi wasn't a thing yet at scale. And we would have to wire all the computers together, but we couldn't do that. We couldn't be in the room. It's harder to gauge reactions that way. So we did a lot of our live trainings over Teams and tried to figure out how we can make those as engaging as possible. How can we use features like taking live polls in meetings, whiteboards in meetings, making sure recordings are available, using the reaction features, making sure that people were enjoying themselves as much as they could, commenting and making sure that everybody had a fun background they could work with, silly things like that, but making sure the staff was engaged. We're varying those training methods both live. I mentioned a couple of times the fact that we came up with those video trainings and repositories. So we also had handouts that we were doing, a different type of email blasts internally for various topics. So focusing on really trying to provide that for as many different learning styles as we could. And the last part, as most of us experienced during COVID, is what I like to call change by necessity. This was the portion where we really didn't have a choice. And I was very surprised in certain situations where we did have some initially resistant staff to certain change, because there was a couple of instances where when this necessity component came in, there was a switch. Once we realized we had to, all of a sudden I had people on board who were leading the charge that I didn't expect. Staff members who were perhaps a little bit on the older side or presented as a little anti-technology, depending on the situation were all of a sudden out in front going, this is going to be good. I'm hearing this from management. I know why I have to do this for my clients. I'm understanding why. So let's get out here and let's make sure that we're still providing the best services that we can. And I'm very fortunate and have to give a shout out to the staff here at Pinebrook as well, because without them, this would not have ultimately been successful. They were willing to accept that change and move forward. This goes back to the theme that I've been weaving in here, teams row together when they share the same direction. If you have somebody paddling one of those oars in the opposite direction, you're either going to spin in circles or definitely not end up where you want to go. So one of the things that we focused on here, what are the attitudes and what are the responses toward technology as well? Where's the messaging coming from? Are we giving positive messaging through administrators, through our supervisors, from IT staff, and from the frontline staff? And when we have frontline staff and we have IT staff sometimes, and we have supervisors who are complaining about the change or upset about the change, what is the message that we need to give then? And how do we weave that back to, okay, we need to understand why this change is important. How do we educate to make sure that everybody is rowing the boat in the same direction? And that portion of it really is a challenge. Some of it ends up being done reactively out of necessity, but here again, we were making sure we had that administrative buy-in. We were making sure that while we were having those conversations at the administrative level, all the supervisors were involved. IT staff was actively involved. We were talking about and coming up with plans together. It wasn't that IT was dictating a plan, is that we were having and still do have biweekly administrative meetings where we sit down and we talk about what those pieces of not only the IT plan, but the plan for the agency as a whole, and IT is a healthy component of that. So making sure that we're having those open conversations, and then also encouraging frontline staff to maybe look at things or view things a little bit differently, because these are some things that we now have to do to make sure that we're helping our clients and serving our clients the best we can. This might be my favorite slide in here overall, talking about stress, change fatigue, and the isolation of working virtually. And this is a huge component to making sure that any type of telehealth program is successful. One of the things that we lost during the pandemic was the ability for us to all be in the same room together and have that social face-to-face interaction. And I've seen countless articles written on that. I've heard a lot of commentary on that, but we missed that basic in the hallway, on the way to the restroom, standing next to the copy machine, by the water cooler kind of talk with our friends. At Pinebrook, there's a Wawa at the end of our parking lot, and a lot of meetings take place between our door and Wawa because we all go for a walk for a cup of coffee, and we were missing that social interaction. So how do we not only foster that type of interaction, but how do we look at staff wellness? We have here at Pinebrook a staff member in one of our programs who is also a part-time yoga instructor. And very early on, we asked her to do some mindfulness and breathing sessions at the beginning of meetings, especially when we know that topics are probably going to be a little stressful. We now have a Mindfulness Monday email blast that goes out. All of our big staff meetings that we have and our admin meetings start with mindfulness and breathing and taking a moment to reflect on a mindfulness reading of some sort to get the brain to stop and give us the ability to have a little bit of time there together. We encouraged our supervisors to check in frequently with their staff. One of the things I used to say early on is it's called virtual meeting software, but you don't have to use it for meetings. You can just call somebody and say, how are you doing? Just like you used to stick their head in your head in their office door, do that virtually. Call them in the middle of the day and say, how are you doing? Have a conversation. That's okay. And we also encouraged our staff to have a little bit of fun. I mentioned the virtual backgrounds. We did things like silly hat day. It was a requirement that day you had to have some sort of silly hat or a silly t-shirt on. And it was amazing what some people were able to put together for some of those days. But we wanted to lighten the mood a little bit and foster that social interaction. The other portion that we focused on heavily was managing one's virtual presence. And what I mean by that is communicating with others, whether or not you're virtually available or you are doing something else. And we did this a lot through Teams with the ability to manage your status. For those of you like me who remember AOL Instant Messenger and those little bleep sounds that used to come up from AOL Instant Messenger back in the late 90s, early 2000s, it's the same type of principle, making sure that you had a status that said, I'm busy, I'm in a meeting, do not disturb, things like that. I am available, so that your fellow staff members, your colleagues knew what was going on, knew it was a good time to message you, maybe not the best time to message you. So we focused a lot on that. There's the ability to put up a message in there also. My message for this today reads, I'm giving a presentation from 12 to approximately 2 o'clock. I'll return messages afterwards. So anybody looking for me knows that I'm not available. So there's not any kind of unreasonable expectation either way there. And that comes down to the two sides of that coin. We encourage not only managing your status so everybody else knows what's going on, but thinking about what you're doing virtually and what your various statuses in all your different apps say about you as a boundary that you're putting up for yourself as well. If my status says I'm not available, I need to be not available. I need to go out to the kitchen. I need to grab a sandwich. I need to eat lunch. I need to take care of myself for a little bit. Maybe I need to do a couple laps around the block or just my house or something to re-energize, and then I can come back, because those are things that we don't necessarily have to worry about at work. You just close an office door and more or less be done with it. Now we have to close that virtual office door. And we also, again, recognizing that saturation, that need to detach, and encouraging that need to detach and unplug, and encouraging staff to use vacation and sick days. Many times I would log in and hear somebody sniffling or sneezing or something sinus related going on. And are you okay? No, I'm not feeling well. You have sick time? Use your sick time. Use all your sick time. Enjoy your sick time. You do not, just because you can sit up and work at your computer when you're working from home, doesn't mean you should sit up and work at your computer when you're working from home. And now that we have all these great tools, like I have Teams on my phone and my smartwatch and my iPad, and I can be Teams pretty much anywhere I am, it's important to remember that when you're off and you're using vacation or you take a personal day, you're off and you're using vacation and you're taking a personal day. And the expectation there, both internally and your own expectations of yourself, that drive to, I need to respond to that, you can temper that a little bit. You're off, you need to be off, and practice some self-awareness, and some really great wellness practices there also.
So Matt, it looks like we might not have time for questions. I'm not sure if you want to kind of make your final points now. We've gone over time, but I've kind of been enraptured with what you're talking about. So
I just leaned down and looked at my phone, and I apologize for running over. This was one of my last two slides, so I'm going to wrap this up as quickly as I can. This is where Pinebrook is now, and I had alluded to some of this earlier, thinking we might get to this point. So 98% of our outpatient services are still telehealth. We plan to keep the majority of our outpatient services, and where we can, our community-based services, telehealth, because we are meeting a need there that we weren't able to, and we're able to back up the quality of our service delivery with good data that says we're doing this and we're doing it well, and we don't need to make that change. In Pennsylvania, the current regulations are such also that they have made provisions for telehealth, so we can continue doing telehealth as part of our regular business, no longer responsibly, but as part of what we now do and incorporate into our practices, and will continue to do so. We also did put in place a client portal, and I did want to talk a little bit more about this, but one of the major pieces that we've put in place in the last year is that client portal, the ability for clients to actively use it, to manage their documentation with us, to sign everything from their intake documentation to their treatment plans, to be able to reference that information on demand has been a huge advantage for us and for our clients. And that means that many times where we did actually have to have some clients come in to sign things, we now have about 1,000 clients in our various programs. So it's not only outpatient, community-based is starting to use the portal now as well, and that's part of the rollout that we're doing currently. But we have 1,000 clients in there who have never come in, never signed documentation, have been 100% virtual the entire way through their journey with us. And the last piece there, I was going to talk a little bit about BYO devices, but I'll skip over that. And I do have 2 slides here. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through them, but I would encourage you to take a look because they talk about IT security. And that I was hoping to be my bookend to this presentation, but with having all these devices at home and the variety of devices that are out there, and with staff members now doing work on their phones and their personal computers in certain situations, it's really important to keep that eye on safety, on IT security awareness, and on some of the threats that are out there for even what some may consider small fish. You may think of Pinebrook, an agency that has 160 employees, maybe not a real big fish in the ocean, but we see daily hack attempts, daily breach attempts on our networks. We see daily phishing emails. We average 500 to 1,000 emails a quarter that are phishing emails, and we've had to contend with that. And I have information there for you on that as well. So thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Matt. And I did read those last 2 slides in preparation, and it is very kind of alarming and interesting to see that. So I apologize that we don't have time for questions. Brandon, are people able to send them in, or?
Yeah, we will get all questions answered, and then we'll email them out just to you guys directly, to all the viewers. Thank you, Matt and Nancy, both of you, for contributing to this fantastic roundtable. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for attending. Just once again, thank you for joining us for today's web forum. I wanted to take a minute to remind everyone that the slides and recording will both be available by tomorrow on the Open Minds website. The full Circle Elite Executive Roundtable series is also available on demand as part of the extensive Open Minds library, and you can also find it on the brand new Open Minds YouTube channel as well. Please join us for our next roundtable on Thursday, August 4th, beginning at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and the topic will be Inspiring Workforce Resiliency Through Activation of the Social Sector, the Social Current Case Study. Karen Johnson, Senior Director of the Change in Mind Institute, and Kelly Martin, Director of Practice Excellence, both from Social Current, will share their process for partnering with organizations to build a resilient workforce that can adapt and thrive in times of change and challenge. For a full list of upcoming roundtables or to register for the August 4th event, please visit the Executive Web Roundtables page under the Events tab at openminds.com. Thank you all for attending.